Lecture 9. Confucianism, Rituals and Relationships.
In the Analects of Confucius, a passage reads, "Confucius would not sit unless his mat was straight." Why does one of the most influential books ever written, a book that articulated a worldview that transformed all of East Asia, concern itself with how Confucius sat? If we understand that, we get an important clue to understanding Chinese and all of East Asian culture. It's impossible to overemphasize the impact of Confucian thought on East Asia. When political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote an influential article in which he divided the world into major civilizations, he labeled one Confucian East Asia. Many scholars agree that despite the profound changes that have occurred in the approximately 2,500 years since Confucius lived, these changes include the coming of Buddhism, communism, and capitalism, the strongest force shaping East Asian culture is still Confucianism. And therefore, one must understand Confucian values in order to understand East Asia. And to do this, we must start with this little book, The Analects of Confucius. Confucius did not write this book. It was written by disciples recalling the master's words and conversations. It's not a systematic treatise, but rather a collection of conversations and remembered sayings and observations. This text has led to countless commentaries and analyses, and for centuries it was the foundation of the system of thought that shaped the Chinese imperial bureaucracy. Sinologist Simon Leys writes, "No book in the entire history of the world has exerted over a longer period of time a greater influence on a larger number of people than this slim little volume. If we ignore this book, we're missing the single most important key that can give us access to the Chinese world. And we can add the East Asian world in general, given the impact that China has had on Korean and Japanese culture." Before we look at this book, I'll talk briefly about Confucius himself. First, what kind of name is Confucius? It doesn't sound remotely Chinese. That's because it isn't. His surname was Kong, and his given name was Qiu. He also had a personal name, Zhongni. So he would be called Kong Qiu, but he was given the honorific title Master, which is Fuzi in Chinese. So he was known as Kong Fuzi, or the shorter form, Kongzi. When Jesuits were translating Chinese names and texts, they Romanized Kong Fuzi as Confucius. And since that's what's familiar to our Western ears, I'll use it here, but Kongzi is more accurate. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, which is in modern Shandong province in China. He wanted a political career, but never achieved high office, which often made him feel like a failure. But if we look at the remarkable achievements of his disciples and his way of thinking, he was successful beyond his wildest imagination. Confucius lived during a time of great chaos in China. During this time, rulers of different states fought against each other for supremacy, often raising large armies that were capable of tremendous brutality. The threat of anarchy was a concern for all philosophers, and these unstable times led to what is known as the Golden Age of Chinese philosophy in China, when the major indigenous schools of Chinese philosophy and religion arose. One reason is that in a time of breakdown, people tend to ask fundamental questions about how things got that way, how things can be restored, and what the meaning of all of it is. Another reason is that the rulers of the various states wanted to defeat their rivals and were looking for systems of governance that would enable them to thrive and succeed. So they invited philosophers from different schools to debate so that they could hear the best ideas of the day and select advisors. Now, Confucius and many of his rivals would journey around China trying to persuade the rulers to hire them or implement their ideas. And along the way, Confucius gathered many disciples, in the process, becoming a teacher. In fact, his willingness to accept anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their social class or ability to pay, and his broad-based approach to education what we might call a liberal arts approach, were innovations. He is revered for virtually creating the role of teacher. And Confucius's birthday is celebrated as Teacher's Day in Taiwan. Now to the Analects, the book. One thing that's striking about a book that's considered a foundational text for a major religious tradition is that, unlike the texts we've seen in Hinduism and Buddhism, there's virtually nothing in the book about post-death existence, or supernatural, or even superhuman beings. Confucius was concerned, more than anything else, about our life on this earth. In one passage, he's asked about how spirits and gods should be served. He replies, "You're not able even to serve man. How can you serve the spirits?" And when asked about death, he replies, "You do not even understand life. How can you understand death?" This doesn't mean that Confucius never talked about death. In fact, the Analects contain many sensitive, thoughtful reflections on how to mourn when loved ones die, or how to face one's own death. But it doesn't spend any time on metaphysical aspects of death or post-death existence. The concern is solely on how death impacts us in this life. Confucius did not set out intending to start his own tradition. He saw himself as a preserver of the past. He said, "I transmit, but do not innovate. I'm devoted to antiquity." In the time of chaos in which he lived, there were many approaches to restoring order and social harmony. Confucius' basic answer was this: there was a time during the reign of the great sage kings when there was perfect order in society. If we can restore the practices and values of that golden age, we can bring back a harmonious, flourishing society. Confucius looked for answers in history, and a reverence for the past is a central feature of Confucian thought. For this reason, the lessons of history must be learned, and learning is one of the most important practices in Confucian thought. If the ways of the Golden Age are going to be reanimated, people would have to study them. And that's why Confucius emphasized learning and study rather than introspection or intuition. He said, "I once spent all day and all night thinking, but I found that I gained nothing from it. It would have been better for me to have spent the time in learning." In the West, we see Rodin's Thinker, a sculpture of a man sitting and thinking. And that's our model. But the Confucian equivalent would show a person with a book, rather than someone lost in his own thoughts. Confucius developed a program of education that focused on the 5 classics, which included a book of odes, poetry, a book focused on ritual practices, 2 books of history, and the I Ching, the text we discussed in the last lecture. Studying these texts was important for 2 reasons. It was a central component to the path of self-cultivation, and it gave people a set of common knowledge and was therefore a way of unifying China through a common cultural inheritance. Ultimately, learning was not for the sake of learning skills to get a job and make money. The gentleman, Confucius said, is not a tool. Rather, it was a way to develop one's character, with the ultimate goal of becoming a cultivated person, and, if possible, a sage. Along with learning from the classics, there's another key component to the Confucian self-cultivation program: ritual, or li. While we might think of ritual in a more elaborate formal sense, Confucians use the word li to refer to a wide range of activities from grand court rituals, akin to our presidential inaugurations, to matters that we'd call etiquette, how to dine well with others, how to introduce yourself to a stranger. People who had internalized the li would be those that we'd consider cultured, considerate, at ease in all situations. The rituals enable one to navigate every possible situation. And for those of you who are parents, think about how much of what we teach our children as they grow up amounts to what the Confucians would call li. Children need to learn what's appropriate in different situations, how to interact with different kinds of people, friends, family members, strangers, authority figures, and so on. Mastering these forms of ritual and etiquette is a key part of what we call becoming a mature person. In a deep sense, ritualization is necessary for becoming fully human, for living among others in society. Ritual both cultivates and expresses the right attitudes and feelings. How do we even communicate something like respect or regret without ritual forms and language? Think of how awkward meeting a new person would be without a ritual form. Ritual also brings people together in communities. Whenever I hold a class, I remind students that the reason that we're all able to sit together in the classroom and have respectful conversations and ask and answer questions and know what's inappropriate humor and what's tasteful is because we've all learned the rituals. And when someone violates the ritual, like interrupts rudely or takes more food at an event than they should, there are ritualized ways of letting the person know. Now just expand this out to an entire society or nation, and you'll see why Confucius believed that it was ritual, more than force or threat of punishment, that created a truly harmonious order. Whereas the modern West has tended to emphasize law as the means to create an ordered society, Confucius saw ritual and virtue as superior to law. Think about this from a Confucian perspective. When you're in a real community, say your neighborhood or among family, at work, or at an organization you belong to, how often is the law invoked to keep order? How often do you threaten to sue someone or call the police? In healthy communities, day-to-day order is kept through ritual. Conflicts are adjudicated through ritual. By the time people invoke law and punishment, there's already been a breakdown in order. So Confucius said, if you guide them by edicts and keep them in line with punishment, the common people will stay out of trouble, but they will have no sense of shame. Guide them by virtue, keep them in line with ritual, and they will, besides having a sense of shame, reform themselves. So in other words, if people have internalized the proper attitudes, there's no need for legal remedies and threats of punishment to keep them in line. Now we're in a position to see why the Analects contains the passage with which I opened the lecture. Confucius would not sit unless his mat was straight. So why is how someone sits ethically relevant? Imagine that you're interviewing people for a job. The person with the best-looking resume comes in to talk to you. As you shake hands and stand together talking for a moment, the person seems articulate and intelligent. You then offer them a seat. And they sit down with their legs completely splayed apart or prop one foot up on your desk. What's the likelihood you'd hire such a person? For the Confucian, everything people do, how they speak to those both in authority over them and to their subordinates, or how they serve as a host at a party, and yes, how they sit, says something about their character. And doing those things the proper way again and again throughout one's life is a way to cultivate the proper character. Over time, through learning and ritual, as well as aesthetic practices such as music and dance, a person cultivates virtues. The Confucian tradition is a virtue-based tradition. And rather than think of ethics in terms of individual actions that can be rationally evaluated as right or wrong, Confucians, like the classical Greeks, focus on human beings and their good and bad characters. The ethical focus is on virtues. And as one cultivates the virtues, Confucians believe, one develops a certain kind of moral power. The ability not only to know the right way to act in situations, but also the ability to influence others. They call this power, de, a word for virtue that also has the meaning of power. For Confucians, it's like a moral charisma. This is the quality that good rulers need to possess. Confucians explained, in administering your government, what need is there for you to kill? Just desire the good yourself, and the common people will be good. The virtue of the gentleman is like wind. The virtue of the small man is like grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend. Now, if moral charisma seems somewhat magical, think about the power that people like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, or Martin Luther King had to move entire nations, not by commanding armies, but by the force of their characters. What virtues were important for Confucius? One of the key virtues is xiao, filial piety, honoring and properly serving one's parents. After I had children, I definitely came to see the wisdom in emphasizing this virtue. Confucius believed that the roots of character are developed in childhood among the family. And if the roots are straight, the person will grow up properly. For Confucians, a foundation of strong, healthy families will produce a harmonious social order. Confucius said, "Being good as a son is perhaps the root of a man's character." Other important virtues are loyalty and reciprocity. But there's one virtue that's the highest virtue, the one that encompasses all others, ren, which is often translated as benevolence. The character for ren consists of the character for person and the character for the number 2. In other words, ren can be seen as person-to-personness, the virtue of co-humanity, or being a human being among other human beings. Ultimately, this is what it's all about: human relationships. Everything we've been talking about, ritual, family, character cultivation, all takes place within relationships. One of the conceptions of the person that has been most prevalent in the modern West is an autonomous, rational agent, an individual. We even have a myth of a self-made man. For Confucians, there is no such thing. We are who we are because of whom we have loved, lived with, and learned from. The Confucian conception of the self is not as a separate, autonomous being. Rather, for Confucians, the self is fully relational. A person is best understood as a nexus of relationships. If you ask someone in the modern West, "Who are you?" you might get a lot of soul-searching in the reply, an attempt to get at some core essence, the unique characteristics or personality of the individual. For Confucians, the answer is straightforward. If someone asked me that question, "Who are you?" and I answered like a Confucian, I'd say, "I'm the son of Mike and Eileen Berkson, husband of Laura, father of Alex and Daniel, brother of Sherry and Jill, teacher of my students, student of my teachers, colleague of my colleagues, and friend of my friends." To know me is to know these relationships that matter to me and make me who I am. And for me to be a good person just means learning to be a good son, husband, father, teacher, and so on. Confucians emphasized 5 key relationships: parent-child, husband-wife, elder brother-younger brother, ruler-subject, and friend-friend. Confucian feminists are working to rid Confucianism of its patriarchy, thinking in terms of elder and younger siblings rather than just brothers. Notice that 3 of the 5 key relationships are familial, and the family is where the virtues are developed and one learns to think of others rather than oneself. One learns respect, loyalty, and affection. One of the relationships is between ruler and subject. But even here, the Confucians saw the ideal society as a family writ large. The ruler would be like a parent, the subjects like children. Now, we who live in a democracy would see this as paternalistic, literally. But for Confucians, a ruler who is benevolent toward his subjects, as a good father would be, and subjects who are loyal the way good children would be, would create a harmonious society. And many Confucian scholars today are writing about various ways to bring together Confucianism and democracy, showing how Confucian democracy would draw on the strengths of both systems while mitigating the weaknesses of each. You'll also notice that 4 of the 5 relationships were considered hierarchical by Confucians. While many of us today, and certainly my wife, would object to the notion that the husband-wife relationship should be seen hierarchically, and Confucian feminists have also reinterpreted this, we could also agree that relationships like parent-child and ruler-subject should be seen hierarchically. Many Westerners have a negative view of hierarchy, but Confucians believe that hierarchy is important to maintain proper order in a healthy society. Teachers should not be their students' buddies. I don't talk with the president of my university the way that I talk with my friends or with my children. And for Confucians, recognizing this is far better than having a false egalitarianism that blurs the boundaries that should be maintained. This is an important point if one wants to understand East Asian culture. Before we leave Confucius, I'd like to present a metaphor of the ideal Confucian society that might help illuminate what the Confucian worldview and values are. In the modern West, our societies are often understood with the model of social contract theory. So we're collections of individuals who come together through mutual agreement in order to protect the rights and autonomy of each individual. There's a great deal of value in this picture. But the Confucians offer us a different understanding of society. Think of society as an orchestra. Each of us participates in accordance with our role, and there's an undeniable hierarchy. There are first violins and second violins. There are those who play more, those who play less. And we play different notes. Otherwise, we'd all be in unison, which would be boring. But if we play well, the result is harmony. And all of us are necessary to produce something beautiful. There must be a leader, a conductor who we all follow, and we must have a great score to play from. In the Confucian case, this is provided by the sage kings of the past. And this image is not of a competitive society, but rather of a cooperative enterprise. Let's conclude our discussion of the Analects with the first two lines from the text. As many Chinese will know these lines. 学而时习之，不亦说乎？有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎? It means to study and then to practice what one has studied. Is this not a joy? To have friends come from afar, is this not happiness? In two simple lines, we see two of the most important Confucian values: learning and relationships. There have been dramatic political, social, and cultural changes in East Asia throughout its history, particularly from the 19th century until today. The influences of communism, capitalism, Christianity, and democracy have transformed the landscape of East Asia. To what extent does Confucianism still characterize East Asian culture? Scholars have argued that Confucianism continues to be one of the most important cultural forces in countries like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Japan. One study tried to determine just how Confucian South Korea is. To begin with, let's look at the breakdown of religious affiliation in South Korea. The two most popular religions are Christianity, with around 29% of Koreans identifying as Christian, and Buddhism, about 23% are Buddhist. It's worth noting that on a percentage basis, this is the most Christian population in East Asia by far. Now, interestingly, over 46% state that they have no religion. But most important for our purposes, only a very small percentage of South Koreans, between 0.2 and 2%, depending on the survey, identify as Confucian. Does that mean that there is little Confucian influence in Korea? The authors of the study noted that very few people will express a religious affiliation with Confucianism because Confucianism has no organized institutions like churches, no process for registering or indicating affiliation, no intentional communities that meet. Well, given that, it's remarkable that in some surveys nearly 800,000 people identify as Confucian. But here's what's really illuminating. The scholars also asked the people to identify their values and practices. And what they discovered is that South Koreans care deeply about the cardinal Confucian virtues, especially filial piety, deference to elders. They maintain the veneration of ancestors and sages, the importance of the family and tradition. They practice Confucian rituals, such as the extended mourning period for parents and memorial ceremonies. In other words, they're deeply Confucian, even if they don't self-identify as such. When they matched the responses with the given religious affiliations of the respondents, they found that 97% of people indicating no religion on the survey were actually Confucian. And what's more, 80% of Protestants and 77% of Buddhists were found to be Confucianized Protestants and Buddhists. Since Confucianism is generally tolerant toward other religions, people are able to combine Confucian values and then practices with other religious commitments. Confucianism in Korea and other parts of East Asia is not preached from pulpits, but rather is propagated through family and schools and the general cultural environment. It's deeply ingrained in East Asians, regardless of their specific religious affiliation. In fact, some scholars say that one must understand Confucianism to understand the way that capitalist economies developed in places like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. After World War II ended, the assumption among many Western scholars was that capitalism could not develop in East Asia because of Confucian culture. Capitalism requires individualism, competitiveness, and a valorization of greed. Confucianism emphasizes relationships and family, cooperation and harmony, and frugality. Confucian texts frequently criticized acquisitiveness and the pursuit of profit as unworthy pursuits for the gentleman. But as we all know, there was a remarkable growth of capitalist economies in these East Asian countries after the war, so much so that it was called the East Asian economic miracle. Scholars had to revisit their assumptions, and many came to a very different conclusion. Due to Confucian culture, East Asia had developed a different sort of capitalism, and it's one that avoids many of the problems inherent in Western capitalism, such as the large income gap between upper management and workers, job instability, high levels of debt. East Asian Confucian capitalism featured family-centered companies, or companies that strive to have a family spirit, strong government guidance in industry, a group orientation which focuses on consensus building and the sharing of responsibilities and rewards rather than individual competition among employees, an emphasis on frugality that led to greater savings rather than consumption, a focus on the long term rather than on quarterly profits, and a strong commitment to human investment and educated, skilled workforce. Of course, this is an idealized picture, and it's changed in many ways in recent years, but it shows the features of Confucianism that can combine with capitalism in a productive way. But what about communist China, where Confucianism was considered a backward way of thinking after the revolution? Does Confucianism still have an influence there? One of the notable features of mainland China in recent years is the revival of Confucianism in politics and everyday life. Confucianism is being taught in primary and secondary schools across China. Courses on university campuses are increasingly popular, and corporations are engaging in Confucian values training, and the Confucius Institute, founded in 2004, based in Beijing, has 140 campuses worldwide. One of the most remarkable signs of this revival is the immense popularity of Yu Dan's book, Reflections on the Analects, which has more copies in print in China, over 10 million, than any book since Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. In the book, she tries to show that Confucianism can teach us a lot about how to live in the modern world. She writes, "The Analects are meant to teach us how to attain spiritual happiness, adjust our daily routines, and find our place in modern life." Major political leaders in China have used Confucian themes and quotations in their speeches. President Hu Jintao talked about Confucian notions of harmony. Prime Minister Wen Jiabao discussed the Confucian virtue of filial piety. Some commentators theorize that the Chinese government is using Confucianism to promote stability and order on a traditional Chinese basis. Finally, it's important to note that Confucianism is now a world religion, as it's traveled wherever East Asians have traveled. It's having an increasing impact on the West, and there's much discussion on the phenomenon that some call Boston Confucianism. In the words of Robert Cummings Neville, Boston Confucianism is the general project of bringing the Confucian tradition into play with the other great civilized traditions in the creation of a world civilization. And to show that Confucianism is not limited to East Asian ethnic application and can in fact be transported to a larger non-East Asian environment. For instance, Boston. Boston is used because of the large number of Confucian thinkers who work in academic institutions there, but it can represent anywhere in the West. While many of these Confucians are of East Asian ancestry, there are many non-Asian Westerners who have come to embrace Confucian values, some of whom developed hybrid religious identities, such as Confucian Christian. One of the main themes of the Boston Confucian conversation is the way that Confucianism can contribute to America and how American cultural influences can contribute to Confucianism. In terms of the Confucian influence, many point out the fact that Confucianism can help temper American individualism, foster a greater sense of family and community. Other themes include a positive valuation of government service, an emphasis on ritual and civility, and the need to guard against instant informality, preserving some sense of formality and hierarchy in social relations. America's contribution to Confucianism can include overcoming Confucianism's patriarchy by bringing a stronger feminist perspective to Confucianism, and placing a greater emphasis on diversity by bringing Confucianism into conversation with the many religious and philosophical traditions here. Unlike many other traditions we'll study, Confucianism does not emphasize the supernatural, a revelation, or life after death. Instead, it sees the sacred in our everyday lives, when we sit down for a meal with our families, when we immerse ourselves in great works of literature, when we gather with friends to enjoy a concert. Tradition, culture, education, the arts, and human relationships, above all family, are worthy of our reverence. And Confucians would say that devoting your time to learning, as you're doing now, is itself a spiritual practice.